"You're fired, you lazy bum," barked the boss's son, Brad, fresh into his director role. I just smirked and walked out of the office. The next morning, his father screamed in rage, "Why did you fire her? Did you even read the contract?" When he opened the document, his face went white because inside it said, Jessica stared at the mahogany desk where she'd worked late countless nights, watching Brad's smug face twist into that familiar sneer. 26 years old, and drunk on daddy's power. That's all he was. She'd built half the client relationships this marketing firm relied on, but here he stood, pointing toward the door like she was some disposable intern. The morning Chicago traffic hummed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Brad delivered his verdict with theatrical flair. Jessica felt something cold settle in her chest, not panic, not even anger. Something sharper, more dangerous. She thought of the contract tucked away in her apartment drawer, the one Richard had insisted she sign when she first joined 5 years ago. Brad clearly hadn't bothered reading the fine print his father had crafted so carefully. Jessica's fingers drummed against her leather portfolio as she absorbed Brad's words. His voice carried that entitled whine she'd grown to despise over the past month since Richard had promoted him to creative director. The kid had never worked a real day in his life, never stayed until midnight perfecting a pitch, never sweet-talked a client back from the edge of walking away. She glanced around the corner office that should have been hers. The promotion she'd earned through blood, sweat, and 5 years of excellence had been handed to Daddy's little prince instead. But Jessica wasn't the type to crumble. Her grandmother hadn't raised her to fold under pressure from spoiled rich boys. The elevator doors couldn't close fast enough as she left that 23rd floor behind. Back in her Lincoln Park apartment, Jessica pulled out the thick manila envelope she'd tucked behind her college textbooks. The contract Richard had presented to her 5 years ago had seemed almost too generous at the time. Excellent salary, comprehensive benefits, and several clauses that had made her raise an eyebrow. Her law school roommate had insisted she was crazy to sign something so complex without a lawyer, but Richard had been persuasive. Now she understood why. Page 12 contained the clause that would make tomorrow very interesting. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former colleague Madison. "Brad's celebrating at the office bar. Says he's cleaning house." Jessica smiled grimly. Let him celebrate. Richard would be back from his business trip to Denver first thing Monday morning. Sunday evening crawled by like molasses. Jessica organized her apartment twice, went for a long run along Lake Michigan, and tried to focus on a novel she'd been meaning to finish. But her mind kept drifting to tomorrow morning's inevitable explosion. She'd worked closely enough with Richard to know exactly how he'd react when he discovered what his precious son had done. The older man had built Peterson Associates from nothing, starting in a cramped office above a deli in 1987. Every major client, every successful campaign, every dollar of profit had been earned through his relentless work ethic. He'd hired Jessica specifically because he recognized that same hunger in her eyes. Brad possessed none of it. Her alarm wouldn't ring for another 10 hours, but Jessica was already wide awake, anticipating the phone call that would change everything. Monday morning arrived with typical Chicago autumn bite. Jessica dressed carefully, her best charcoal suit, the one that made her feel invincible during client presentations. She wouldn't be going to the office today, but she wanted to look professional when Richard inevitably summoned her. Her phone rang at exactly 8:47 a.m. Richard's assistant Cameron sounded frazzled, practically breathless as she asked Jessica to come in immediately. Through the phone, Jessica could hear shouting in the background. Richard's voice raised to a volume she'd never heard before. Even from 20 floors below, Brad was probably feeling the walls shake. Jessica checked her reflection one last time, grabbed the contract from her kitchen counter, and headed downtown. The real show was about to begin. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt longer than usual. Jessica could hear the commotion before the doors even opened, Richard's voice booming down the hallway, punctuated by Brad's higher-pitched protests. She walked past her former colleagues, who watched with wide eyes and carefully neutral expressions. Madison caught her eye and mouthed, "Good luck." Cameron gestured frantically toward Richard's office, where father and son were locked in what sounded like the argument of the century. Through the glass walls, Jessica could see Brad's face had gone pale, while Richard paced behind his desk like a caged animal. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. Both men turned toward her, Richard's eyes blazing with fury, Brad's filled with something that looked suspiciously like fear. Richard's office felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The older man's face was flushed red, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Brad stood near the window, looking like he wanted to disappear into the Chicago skyline behind him. Richard's eyes locked onto Jessica, with an intensity that might have intimidated her 5 years ago. Now she met his gaze steadily, the contract folder held loosely in her hands. She'd learned to read his moods during their countless strategy sessions, and right now he was beyond furious. He was panicked. Brad opened his mouth to speak, but Richard cut him off with a sharp gesture. The silence stretched taut between the three of them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below and the nervous clicking of Brad's expensive pen. Richard moved toward his desk with the predatory grace she remembered from hostile client meetings. He was 62, but still carried himself like the young entrepreneur who'd built this empire from scratch. His hands shook slightly as he reached for a thick folder. Jessica recognized it as the master copy of all employee contracts. Brad had gone completely silent, which was probably the smartest thing he'd done all week. Jessica watched Richard flip through pages with increasing desperation, his breathing growing more labored with each passing second. When he finally found her contract, his face went white as fresh snow. The numbers were right there in black and white. Page 12, Section 7, Subsection C. The clause that Richard himself had insisted upon, back when he'd been worried about competitors poaching his best talent. The clause was elegantly simple and absolutely devastating. Any employee terminated without just cause within their first 5 years would receive a severance package equal to 50% of the company's annual profit margin, calculated from their hire date forward. Richard had designed it as a golden parachute to attract top talent, never imagining his own son would be stupid enough to trigger it. Jessica had generated approximately $4 million in revenue during her tenure. The company's profit margin averaged 32%. Brad's impulsive firing had just cost Peterson Associates roughly $640,000. Richard sank into his leather chair, the contract trembling in his hands. Brad finally understood why his father had been screaming, and the color drained from his face like water from a broken pipe. Jessica remained perfectly still, letting the mathematics speak for themselves. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jessica could practically see the calculations running through Richard's mind. Payroll, overhead, upcoming quarterly taxes, the new lease on the expanded office space. $640,000 wasn't just money. It was the difference between a profitable year and a devastating loss. Brad slumped against the window, finally grasping the magnitude of his mistake. He'd always been careless with money because it had never been his own. Now his recklessness threatened to cripple the company his father had spent 3 decades building. Richard looked up at Jessica with something approaching desperation. She'd seen that expression once before, during the Kellerman Industries crisis 2 years ago when they'd almost lost their biggest client. Back then, she'd worked 18-hour days to save the account. Today, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Jessica set the contract folder on Richard's desk with deliberate precision. She'd practiced this moment in her mind dozens of times over the past 36 hours, but the reality felt surreal. The man who'd been her mentor, her champion, her gateway to success, now needed her more than she'd ever needed him. Richard's voice came out hoarse and strained when he finally spoke. He asked about alternatives, about negotiations, about anything that might reduce the financial impact. Jessica listened patiently, the same way she'd listened to desperate clients trying to salvage failed campaigns. But contracts were contracts, and Richard had taught her never to show weakness in business negotiations. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Brad stood frozen by the window, smart enough to keep his mouth shut, while his father tried to clean up the mess he'd created. Jessica had come prepared for this conversation. She pulled out a second folder, her own research into Peterson associate's current financial status, public records, industry reports, client retention data she'd compiled during her years handling account management. Richard's eyes widened as he recognized his company's most sensitive information laid out with surgical precision. The numbers painted a clear picture. The firm was successful but not liquid. Most of their capital was tied up in long-term investments, new equipment, and the recent office expansion Brad had pushed for. A $600,000 hit would force them to liquidate assets, possibly even lay off junior staff members. Jessica had worked alongside these people for 5 years. She knew their families, their dreams, their financial struggles. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, but she kept her expression neutral. Business was business, just as Richard had always taught her. Richard leaned back in his chair, aging a decade in the space of minutes. Jessica could see him running through scenarios, calculating options, searching for any escape route from the financial catastrophe his son had created. Brad remained pressed against the window like he was trying to merge with the glass. Then Jessica spoke for the first time since entering the office. Her voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of the steel Richard had always admired in her character. She wasn't here for revenge or vindication. She was here to propose a solution that would benefit everyone involved. The offer was simple and elegant. She would waive the severance clause in exchange for something far more valuable than money, a 49% ownership stake in Peterson Associates, effective immediately. Richard's face went through a dozen different expressions before settling on grudging respect. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Jessica watched Richard process the implications while Brad finally understood that his father's company, his inheritance, was slipping away because of his own stupidity. 49% ownership meant Jessica would have equal say in all major decisions, veto power over hirings and firings, and a permanent seat at the leadership table. Richard had built Peterson Associates to pass down to his son, but Brad had just proven he wasn't ready for that responsibility. Maybe he never would be. Jessica, on the other hand, had demonstrated exactly the kind of ruthless intelligence the business world demanded. The older man's hands stopped shaking as he considered the offer. It was brilliant, really. Jessica would become his partner rather than his employee, invested in the company's success rather than just collecting a paycheck. And Brad would learn a very expensive lesson about the consequences of emotional decision-making. Richard stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing with each second that passed. He walked to the window where Brad still stood frozen, placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder, and delivered a lecture that was 26 years overdue. Jessica watched the family drama unfold with professional detachment, though part of her felt sorry for Brad's public humiliation. The young man had grown up with every advantage money could buy, but he'd never learned the value of earning respect through competence. His father's company had been his playground, and he treated the employees like toys he could break without consequences. Now reality was teaching him a lesson no amount of privilege could shield him from. When Richard finished speaking, Brad looked like he might cry. Jessica almost felt bad for him. Almost. Richard returned to his desk and pulled out the company's incorporation documents. His movements were deliberate, resigned, but not defeated. Jessica recognized the expression from difficult client meetings. The moment when a negotiator realizes they're beaten and decides to make the best deal possible under the circumstances. Brad finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak protest about family legacy and birthright. Richard silenced him with a look that could have frozen Lake Michigan. The older man had spent 3 decades building something meaningful, and he wouldn't let his son's immaturity destroy it in a single morning. Jessica pulled out her own pen and set it beside the documents. The partnership agreement would need to be drafted by lawyers, but they could sign a preliminary agreement right here, right now. Richard nodded slowly, understanding that delay would only give Brad another opportunity to make things worse. The preliminary partnership agreement took 15 minutes to draft and sign. Jessica's handwriting was steady, confident, while Richard's signature carried the weight of a man who just made the most important business decision of his career. Brad refused to witness the document, but Cameron was called in to make it official. As Jessica signed her name on the line marked co-owner, she thought about her grandmother's advice. Sometimes you have to let people dig their own graves, honey. Just make sure you're not standing in the hole with them. Brad had been digging furiously for weeks, and now he was buried under the consequences of his own actions. Richard looked exhausted but oddly relieved. He'd found a way to save his company and ensure its future, even if it meant sharing control with someone who'd been his employee just an hour ago. The news spread through the office like wildfire. Jessica walked back to her old desk, which was somehow still hers, though her title had changed from senior account manager to co-owner, and found Madison waiting with wide eyes and barely contained excitement. The whispered conversations and curious glances followed her down the hallway. Brad had disappeared, probably to lick his wounds and figure out how to explain this disaster to his trust fund friends. Jessica felt a momentary wave of sympathy for him, but it passed quickly. He'd had every advantage in life and had chosen to waste them on petty power games and inherited arrogance. Her phone buzzed with a text from her law school roommate. Saw the news on LinkedIn. You magnificent genius. Drinks tonight? Jessica smiled for the first time in days. Maybe she would celebrate after all. 6 months later, Peterson & Associates had its most profitable quarter in company history. Jessica's partnership had brought stability, strategic thinking, and a renewed focus on client relationships that had been lacking during Brad's brief reign of terror. She'd kept her promise to protect the junior staff, and morale had never been higher. Richard had adapted to sharing leadership better than expected. Their partnership worked because they shared the same fundamental values: excellence, integrity, and respect for the people who made success possible. Brad had eventually returned to the company in a junior role, humbled and hopefully wiser. Jessica stood in her new office, the corner space with the best view of Lake Michigan, and thought about the contract clause that had changed everything. Sometimes the most important protections were the ones you hoped you'd never need to use. The morning Chicago sun streamed through Jessica's office windows as she reviewed the quarterly reports. Peterson Associates was thriving under joint leadership, and she'd proven that competence mattered more than bloodline when it came to business success. Her partnership with Richard had evolved into genuine mutual respect, built on shared commitment to excellence. Brad knocked on her door, holding a client proposal he'd worked on for weeks. His attitude had transformed completely, the entitled arrogance replaced by genuine effort to earn his place in the company. Jessica reviewed his work carefully, offered constructive feedback, and watched him absorb the criticism without defensiveness. As he left her office, Jessica reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. One impulsive decision by a spoiled rich kid had transformed her from employee to owner, from subordinate to partner. Sometimes justice came in the most unexpected packages.